Okay, thank you, Jen. As we were talking, foreign aid and international development is one of your main focus of your research, but I want to focus it more on the countries you've worked on. From my perspective of what I've seen is that foreign aid and development aid can undermine informal institutions. Did you see anything of this, or did it have an effect on concepts such as democracy, civil society, individual empowerment? If you can tell us a little bit more about like maybe specific cases that you saw.
Yeah, aid certainly has played a role in undermining many of those things, even though I think in some cases it has worked to empower. I can think of some cases. I think it really just depends on how it works. So for example, I'm doing some work in Ukraine right now, and I think that the Ukrainian model could be a very interesting and important one for us to look at, because rather than working through third-party intermediaries, many donors are working directly with local governments, and they're providing funds and resources to local government officials saying, you decide how reconstruction will look, you decide how the money will be spent. And these are democratically elected local governance structures where there's a lot of legitimacy and a lot of oversight. Now, of course, there's still corruption in Ukraine, but a lot of that corruption is at the national level, like this grand scale kinds of corruption that I know Guatemalans are familiar with. But Ukraine in many ways it is not typical of most places because of Russia's war. This was a European country with a history of governance and institutions, and the institutions there were stronger than we find in many parts of the world where aid is prevalent. So I also want to be careful about not drawing too much from that example, but I do think it's an insightful one to think about the future. And in other parts of the world, I have certainly seen how well-intentioned aid has been channeled to communities, but actually undermines cooperation. So for example, in my first book, that came out about a decade ago, I described how increased levels of aid yielded more corruption, perceptions of corruption, and yielded more conflict in communities. So the increased aid actually exacerbated tensions, and people were less able to solve problems in their communities than they were before the aid came in. And to me, that was in Afghanistan, and that was really troubling because the whole purpose of the state-building effort was to bring peace and stability, yet the aid itself was fundamentally destabilizing.
And do you think that has something to do with how international organizations see the state? They have this idealized version of the state, so they deliver the aid through state institutions, but the state is also the main source of conflict in a lot of societies.
So in this case, in Afghanistan, there was often the case that you didn't see aid donors working through the state because the state was so weak and so corrupt. And so you saw many, many NGOs everywhere. And it seemed like at times, and then the government actually criticized donors for, working so much through NGOs and not working through the state at all. But I think what I saw was not donors idealizing the state, but idealizing communities. And if we give the money to communities, it'll be great, it'll be lovely, and they'll solve all the problems. And then we can just connect the communities to the state. And that'll solve problems too. But the external resources and the competition that it generated inside of communities undermined cooperation and collective action. That's something I can say for certain.
Yeah, I think that has also something to do with how this NGOs or the communities see the aid, because sometimes they see it as a bag of money that has no end, so they can compete between each other, and that just creates tension between the communities, and instead of empowering them, it's making them weaker.
Right. So often I would find that people had a lot of complaints about aid. They had real complaints about the way that aid was distributed. And I saw this actually when I worked at USAID as well, when I talked to recipients. But they didn't want to tell you because they feared, it was like a strategic interaction. They fear that if I tell you now that I don't like it, then you're not going to give me more aid, and I'm seen as complaining. And that means that the next time there's a project, you won't consider our village, even though I don't like the aid, but I can either siphon things off from it or, bet that maybe sometime in the future you're going to do something I like, or you're going to grow up, or you're going to learn how to be more effective and, engage with us better. And especially when you're dealing with very, very poor societies. Central Asia is extremely poor in comparison to Guatemala, very poor. And I think the per capita GDP of Afghanistan is like $400, $438, where in Guatemala it's well over $6,000 a year. In Tajikistan, it's around $900 a year. So these are very poor countries, landlocked countries, no access to trade and resources. It's very, very difficult to get goods in and out. Things are expensive when you really have to rely on so many of your neighbors to get things in and out. So, but then aid has such an oversized influence because you're so poor.
And I think if we're in this effort to rethink for foreign aid and development, what are the questions that international organizations should be making to involve the communities, to make them part of the decision-making process and actually address the problems that they have?
So this is a really good question, and it's actually a research question that I'm tackling right now. And I have to tell you that I'm uncertain. I'm uncertain because there are a lot of efforts to do what they call community-driven development. And what those do is it makes it look like, okay, every community gets a project, the community then decides what the project they're going to implement looks like. And that sounds great on paper, but in practice it never really works politically, I think the way that many people intend, and donors are often then chasing the communities are chasing donor priorities rather than their own, because donors restrict what they can do, they restrict how they can do it, they have to follow World Bank procurement regulations and things like that. And that has actually often led to a lot of corruption as well.
Yeah, because they would spend more time lobbying the organizations than actually delivering the aid. So I think this is a very interesting topic, and we can continue talking about this, but I feel like we can come to an end with this. So thank you, Jen.
Of course, thank you.